The sound of her horse coming up the ridge made Warren Zane's hand freeze halfway to his coffee cup. And when he looked through the window of his ranch house that October morning in 1878, he saw the one woman he'd spent 7 years trying to forget. Catherine Vaughn sat atop a dusty mare, her dark hair pinned beneath a worn black hat. And even from this distance, Warren could see how thin she'd become, how her traveling dress hung loose on a frame that had once been soft and full of life. She dismounted slowly, favoring her right side, and tied her horse to the post with hands that trembled visibly. Warren's heart hammered against his ribs as memories crashed over him like a flash flood through an arroyo. Catherine laughing at his terrible jokes during church socials in Laramie. Catherine's hand brushing his as they walked through town. Catherine telling him she'd chosen Thomas instead, that Thomas Garrett was steadier, more reliable, the kind of man a woman could build a life with. Thomas had been Warren's best friend since they were boys catching frogs in the creek behind the schoolhouse. They'd learned to ride together, worked cattle together, got drunk on stolen whiskey together when Warren's father died. When Catherine chose Thomas, Warren had shaken his friend's hand and smiled until his face ached, then packed up and left Laramie for good. He drifted south through Colorado before settling here in Green River, Wyoming, where the land was harsh but honest, and a man could lose himself in the work of building something from nothing. Now Catherine was climbing his porch steps, and Warren forced himself to open the door before she could knock. Up close, he could see the purple shadows under her eyes, the way her lips were chapped and bleeding at the corners, the wedding ring still on her left hand despite the black mourning dress that told him everything he needed to know. "Warren," she said, and her voice cracked on his name. I didn't know where else to go. He stepped aside without a word, and she walked past him into the simple cabin he'd built with his own hands. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair his mother had given him before she passed. Catherine stood in the center of it all looking lost, her hands clutching a small carpet bag that seemed to hold everything she owned. "Thomas," Warren asked, though he already knew the answer, "Pneumonia. 6 weeks ago." Catherine's voice was flat, drained of emotion. "We'd had 2 hard winters. Lost most of the cattle. Thomas worked himself sick trying to keep the ranch going, and then the fever came and I couldn't." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "I couldn't save him." Warren wanted to reach for her, to pull her against his chest and promise everything would be all right, but 7 years and a dead man stood between them. "Sit down," he said instead. "I'll make you something to eat." "I sold the ranch to pay the debts," Catherine continued as if she hadn't heard him. She sank into one of the chairs, her carpet bag falling to the floor. "There was nothing left. Thomas's brother said I could come live with his family in Cheyenne, but I'd be a charity case, Warren. Another mouth to feed. I thought maybe. I remembered you'd come to Green River. Someone in Laramie said you had land here. I thought maybe you might need help. I can cook and clean and work. I'm not asking for anything except a chance to earn my keep." The desperation in her voice cut him deeper than any blade. This was Catherine Vaughn, the girl who'd beaten him at every spelling bee in school, who could ride better than most men, who'd once told him she wanted to see the ocean someday. Now she was reduced to begging for work from a man whose heart she'd broken. "You don't have to earn anything," Warren said roughly. He busied himself at the stove, slicing bread and frying eggs, grateful for something to do with his hands. "You need rest and food, and then we'll figure things out." Catherine ate like someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks, which Warren suspected was probably true. He watched her from across the table, noting how her hands shook less as she got food into her stomach, how some color returned to her pale cheeks. She'd always been beautiful, but it was more than that. Catherine had a quick mind and a quicker tongue, a fierce independence that had both attracted and terrified him when they were young. "Tell me about the ranch," Catherine said after she'd finished eating. "How much land do you have?" 300 acres along the Green River. I run about 200 head of cattle, have a good string of horses. It's not much, but it's mine." Warren poured her more coffee. "Been here 5 years now. Built the house first winter, the barn the next spring. Added the corrals last year." "That's good land," Catherine said. "Thomas always said the territory along the Green River was some of the best grazing in Wyoming." The mention of Thomas's name hung in the air between them. Warren cleared his throat. He was right. "The grass comes in thick after the snow melts, and the river never runs dry, even in the worst summers." Catherine's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "He was a good man, Warren. I know you probably think I'm heartless for coming here, but I did love him. I tried to be a good wife." "I never doubted that," Warren said, and meant it. Whatever pain Catherine had caused him, he'd never believed she was cruel. She'd made a choice and it hadn't been him. That was all. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. I've got a spare room I use for storage. We can clear it out, make it proper." "I'll work for my keep," Catherine insisted. "I'm not a charity case." "Nobody said you were," Warren replied. "But you need to rest and get your strength back first. We can talk about work later." They spent the rest of that day in careful politeness, dancing around each other like strangers. Warren showed Catherine to the spare room, which was indeed full of tools and tack and supplies. Together they cleared it out, and Warren carried in a narrow bed and a small dresser. It wasn't much, but Catherine looked at it like he'd given her a palace. That night, Warren lay in his own bed listening to the sound of Catherine crying through the thin wall between their rooms, and he stared at the ceiling wondering what kind of fool invited this particular brand of torture into his life. The next morning, Warren woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing. He pulled on his clothes and walked into the main room to find Catherine already dressed, her hair braided down her back, working at his stove like she'd been doing it for years. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I told you I'd earn my keep." Catherine didn't turn around. "Breakfast will be ready in a few minutes. You've got a good setup here, Warren. Better than what Thomas and I managed." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a statement of fact, but it still made Warren uncomfortable. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table, watching her work. She moved efficiently despite her obvious exhaustion, and he realized she probably couldn't sit still, couldn't let herself stop moving, or she'd have to think about everything she'd lost. After breakfast, Catherine insisted on cleaning up while Warren went out to tend the animals. He'd hired a ranch hand named Pete who came up from town 3 days a week to help with the heavy work, but today was Sunday and Pete would be with his family. Warren fed the horses, checked the cattle in the near pasture, and repaired a section of fence that had worked loose. The physical labor felt good, gave him time to think. Having Catherine here was going to be complicated in ways he couldn't begin to untangle. Part of him still ached for her, would probably always ache for her, but she was grieving and vulnerable, and Warren wasn't the kind of man who'd take advantage of that. She needed a friend right now, needed stability and safety, and he could give her those things without asking for anything in return. He'd built a good life here in Green River. He could share it without losing himself. When he came back to the house at noon, Catherine had cleaned everything within an inch of its life. The floors had been swept and scrubbed, the windows washed, his clothes mended and folded. She'd even taken down the curtains and beaten the dust out of them. "You didn't have to do all this," Warren said, looking around at the transformation. "I needed to keep busy." Catherine wiped her hands on her apron. "I found some venison in your cold box. I thought I'd make a stew for supper." "That sounds good." Warren hung his hat on the peg by the door. "But Catherine, you don't have to work yourself to death to justify being here." She finally looked at him, really looked at him, and Warren saw the raw grief in her eyes. "If I stop moving, I'll fall apart," she said simply. "Please just let me do this." So Warren let her work, and they fell into an uneasy rhythm over the next few weeks. Catherine cooked and cleaned and tended the kitchen garden that had gone to weeds since Warren had no time to maintain it properly. Warren worked the ranch and tried to ignore how right it felt to come home to a warm house and hot food, and the sound of another person moving through the rooms. They talked sometimes in the evenings, careful conversations about safe topics. Catherine told him about Laramie, how the town had grown, which families had moved away and which had stayed. Warren told her about Green River, about the other ranchers in the valley, about the harsh winter of '76 when he'd nearly lost everything to the cold and snow. They didn't talk about the past, about the time before Catherine had chosen Thomas. They didn't talk about feelings or regrets or the way Warren sometimes caught Catherine watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. November came with cold winds and the promise of snow. Warren rode into Green River one afternoon to pick up supplies and ran into Doc Morrison at the general store. The doctor was a grizzled old man who'd been practicing medicine in Wyoming Territory for 30 years. "Heard you've got yourself a woman out at your place," Doc said without preamble. News traveled fast in a small town. "She's a friend," Warren said. "Her husband died. She needed a place to stay." Doc studied him with sharp eyes. "She all right. I heard she came from Laramie looking half-starved." "She's getting better," Warren said. "Eating regular, getting some rest." "You bringing her to the social next week?" Doc asked. "Thanksgiving gathering at the church. Whole valley turns out for it." Warren hadn't thought about it. "I don't know if she's ready for that. Might do her good to meet people, feel part of a community again." Doc clapped him on the shoulder. "Think about it." Warren did think about it, and that night over supper he mentioned the Thanksgiving social to Catherine. She looked startled, then uncertain. "I don't know, Warren. People will talk. A widow living alone with a man who isn't her husband." "People are going to talk regardless," Warren said. "Might as well give them a chance to meet you proper. Besides, it's a good gathering. Whole valley comes together, food and music and folks being neighborly." Catherine bit her lip, considering. "Would you want me to go with you?" "I'm going regardless," Warren said, "but I think you might enjoy it." So the following week, they rode into Green River together in Warren's wagon. Catherine wore the same black morning dress, but she'd washed and pressed it until it looked nearly new. And she'd done something different with her hair that made her look younger, more like the girl Warren remembered from Laramie. The church social was held in the town's community hall, a large wooden building that served as church, school, and gathering place. When Warren and Catherine walked in, conversation paused for a moment as everyone took in the sight of Warren Zane with a woman at his side. Then people returned to their business, though Warren caught plenty of curious looks. Doc Morrison's wife, Martha, came over immediately, a warm smile on her round face. "You must be Catherine. Warren told us about you. I'm so sorry for your loss." Catherine looked surprised by the genuine sympathy. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. Call me Martha, dear. Everyone does." She linked her arm through Catherine's. "Come meet some of the other ladies. We're always glad to have new faces in the valley." Warren watched Martha lead Catherine away to a cluster of women and felt himself relax slightly. He'd been worried about how people might receive her, but Green River was a frontier town where most folks had come from somewhere else, often leaving troubled pasts behind. Nobody here was going to judge Catherine for being widowed and down on her luck. The evening passed pleasantly. There was food enough to feed an army, and after supper, some of the men brought out fiddles and guitars. Warren found himself pulled into conversation with his neighbors, catching up on news and discussing plans for the winter. He kept an eye on Catherine across the room and saw her talking with the other women, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. When the dancing started, Warren made his way to Catherine. She looked up at him with something like alarm in her eyes. "I don't think I should," she said before he could ask. "I'm still in mourning. It's just a dance, Catherine. Nobody here is going to fault a widow for trying to live a little." But Warren didn't push. Instead, he stood beside her and watched the other couples swirl around the floor. They rode home in comfortable silence, the wagon rattling over the frozen ground under a sky full of stars. When they reached the ranch, Catherine surprised him by speaking. "Thank you for taking me tonight. It was good to be around people again. I'd forgotten what that felt like." "You're welcome anytime," Warren said. "Green River's a good town, good people." That night marked a shift in their relationship. Catherine seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by grief. She still worked hard around the house, but now she'd take breaks to sit on the porch and watch the valley, or to read one of Warren's books by the fire in the evening. December brought the first real snow, a heavy storm that blanketed the valley in white and kept them close to the house for 3 days. Warren used the time to repair tack and sharpen tools, while Catherine baked bread and mended clothes. They talked more, their conversations growing easier, more natural. "You ever regret leaving Laramie?" Catherine asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Warren considered the question carefully. "Sometimes. I left behind a lot of memories there, but I needed to start fresh somewhere. Green River gave me that chance." "You left because of me," Catherine said softly, "because I chose Thomas. There didn't seem to be any point in denying it. Partly, but also because I needed to figure out who I was without Thomas always there. We'd been joined at the hip since we were kids. I needed to stand on my own." "Did it work?" "Yeah," Warren said. "I think it did. I built something here, something that's mine." Catherine stared into the fire. "I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd chosen differently, if I'd chosen you instead." Warren's heart clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "No point wondering about that now. You made your choice. I made mine. We both lived with them." "Were you happy?" Catherine asked. "These past 7 years, happy enough," Warren said. "I had good work, good land, peace and quiet." "That's more than a lot of men can say." "What about you?" Catherine was quiet for a long time. "I tried to be happy. Thomas was good to me. He never raised his hand or his voice. He worked hard. But there was always something missing, Warren. I don't know how to explain it. Like I was living someone else's life instead of my own." "That's grief talking," Warren said gently. "When someone dies, we remember all the things that weren't perfect. Doesn't mean you didn't have good times too." "We did have good times," Catherine agreed, "especially at first. But the last couple years were hard. The ranch struggling, Thomas working himself sick, me feeling helpless to do anything about it." She looked at Warren. "Do you ever think about the night before I married Thomas?" Warren went still. He thought about that night constantly, had replayed it in his mind 1,000 times over the years. They'd run into each other on the street in Laramie, both of them restless the night before the wedding. They'd walked together to the edge of town, talking about nothing and everything. And when Warren had finally worked up the courage to ask if she was sure about marrying Thomas, Catherine had kissed him. One kiss, soft and desperate and full of everything they weren't saying, and then she'd pulled away and run back toward town. "I remember," Warren said quietly. "I've never forgotten it," Catherine whispered. "Even when I was trying to be a good wife to Thomas, trying to build a life with him, I never forgot that kiss." Warren stood abruptly, needing distance before he did something foolish. Catherine, you're grieving and vulnerable right now. You're looking for comfort, for connection. I won't take advantage of that. Catherine stood too, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Is that what you think this is? Me looking for comfort? I don't know what it is, Warren said honestly, but I know it's too soon. Thomas has been dead less than 3 months. You need time to heal. And what if time doesn't change how I feel? Catherine demanded. What if I realize I made the wrong choice 7 years ago? Then we'll talk about it when you're ready, Warren said. But not now, not like this. Catherine's face crumpled, but she nodded. She went to her room without another word, leaving Warren standing by the fire wondering if he'd just made the right decision or the biggest mistake of his life. Christmas came and went quietly. Warren gave Catherine a new dress he'd ordered from the general store, a deep blue that matched her eyes. Catherine gave him a shirt she'd sewn herself, the stitching so fine, and even it looked like something from a professional tailor. They attended church services on Christmas morning and shared a simple dinner that afternoon, both of them careful not to mention their conversation from earlier in the month. January brought bitter cold and fierce winds that howled around the house like living things. Warren spent his days breaking ice in the water troughs and making sure the cattle had access to the hay he'd stored up. Catherine kept the house warm and the meals hot, and slowly, gradually, they found their way back to easier companionship. February arrived with a thaw, and one morning Warren woke to find Catherine already outside, standing by the corral fence watching the sunrise. He pulled on his coat and boots and joined her, neither of them speaking for a long moment. "It's been 6 months since Thomas died," Catherine said finally. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about needing time to heal." Warren waited, his heart beating hard against his ribs. "I loved Thomas," Catherine continued. "But I think I loved the idea of him more than the man himself. He was safe and steady, everything a young woman is supposed to want. But he wasn't you, Warren. He was never you." "Catherine, let me finish," she interrupted. "I know I hurt you when I chose him. I know leaving Laramie cost you, building this life here. I can't change any of that. But I've had 6 months to think and grieve and figure out what I want, and what I want is another chance. Not because I'm grieving or vulnerable or looking for security, but because I made a mistake 7 years ago and I'd like the opportunity to fix it." Warren turned to look at her, really look at her. The morning sun caught in her dark hair, turned her pale skin golden. She met his gaze steadily, and Warren saw no uncertainty there, no desperation, just honest hope. "I never stopped loving you," Warren said, the words coming out rough and unpolished. "Even when I thought I had, even when I tried to move on, you've been in my heart this whole time." Catherine's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Then maybe we could try this properly. Court each other the right way this time. No rushed decisions, no choosing based on what we think we should want, just seeing where it leads." Warren reached out and took her hand, her fingers cold in his warm grip. "I'd like that." They took it slow, which felt strange given their history, but also right. Warren courted Catherine the way he should have 7 years ago, with proper attention and romantic gestures. He brought her wildflowers when they first bloomed in March. He took her on picnics by the river when the weather warmed. They rode out together to check the cattle, Catherine proving she'd lost none of her skill in the saddle. The people of Green River watched this courtship with interest and approval. Martha Morrison told Catherine at church one Sunday that she'd never seen Warren Zane smile so much, and it was about time he found himself a good woman. Other neighbors echoed the sentiment, welcoming Catherine into the community in ways that made her feel truly at home for the first time in years. April brought new calves and longer days, and the kind of perfect spring weather that made everything feel possible. Warren and Catherine fell into an easy partnership, working the ranch together, sharing meals and conversation and slowly building something new from the ashes of what might have been. One evening in May, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Warren had been working up the courage for this moment for weeks now, and he figured there was no perfect time, so it might as well be now. "Catherine," he said, "I know we said we'd take this slow, but I'm not a patient man by nature. I've waited 7 years for you, and I'd like to stop waiting." Catherine turned to look at him, curiosity and something deeper in her eyes. "What are you saying, Warren?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "I'm saying I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife, not my housekeeper or my friend or the woman I'm courting. I want to build a real life together, raise a family if we're blessed with one, grow old together in this valley. Will you marry me?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, Warren Zane, I will marry you." Warren slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her close, kissing her properly for the first time since that night in Laramie 7 years ago. This kiss was different, though, full of promise instead of desperation, beginning instead of ending. They married in June at the Green River Church with the whole valley in attendance. Catherine wore a cream-colored dress that Martha Morrison had helped her sew, and Warren wore his best suit. Doc Morrison stood up as Warren's best man, and Martha served as Catherine's matron of honor. It was a simple ceremony, but it felt right in a way Warren's half-imagined wedding to Catherine all those years ago never had. That night they lay together in the bed they'd now share, Catherine's head on Warren's chest, his arm around her shoulders. "You think Thomas would forgive me?" Catherine asked softly. For moving on, for being happy, Warren thought about his old friend, about the boy he'd grown up with and the man Thomas had become. "I think Thomas would want you to be happy. He loved you, Catherine. That means wanting good things for you, even after he's gone." "I hope you're right," she whispered. "I know I am," Warren said. "Thomas was my best friend. I knew him better than anyone except maybe you. He'd be glad you weren't alone, glad you found someone to take care of you." "I don't need someone to take care of me," Catherine said, poking him in the ribs. "I need someone to build a life with. That's different." Warren grinned. "Fair point." They built that life together through the summer and fall. Catherine proved herself invaluable on the ranch, working alongside Warren with a skill and determination that impressed even Pete, the ranch hand. When Pete mentioned his cousin was looking for work, Warren hired the young man on full time, which allowed Warren and Catherine to spend more time improving the ranch house and expanding their operations. Winter came again, but this time Warren and Catherine faced it together, snug in their home with plenty of supplies laid in. They spent the long evenings by the fire, making plans for the spring, talking about everything and nothing. In March, Catherine told Warren she was pregnant. He'd been mending a bridle at the kitchen table when she spoke, and he looked up at her with such joy in his face that Catherine started crying and laughing at the same time. "A baby," Warren said wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Catherine asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Warren said. He pulled her into his lap, cradling her close. "When?" "October, I think. Maybe early November." Warren pressed his hand to her still flat stomach. "A fall baby, that's good timing. Gives us the summer to get ready." They spent the next months preparing, Warren building a cradle with his own hands while Catherine sewed tiny clothes and blankets. The women of Green River rallied around Catherine, showering her with advice and hand-me-down baby items. Martha Morrison promised to be there for the birth, having delivered half the babies in the valley over the years. Their son was born on a cold October evening in 1880, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Warren held his son for the first time with shaking hands, counting tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfect miracle of this new life. "What should we name him?" Catherine asked from the bed, exhausted but radiant. Warren looked at his wife, at this woman who'd come back into his life when both of them needed second chances. "What about Thomas, after your first husband? It seems right somehow." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure? I don't want to cause you pain." "Thomas was my best friend before he was your husband," Warren said. "Honoring his memory doesn't cause me pain. And maybe it's a way of telling him we're okay, that we're going to raise this boy right, teach him about the man whose name he carries." So they named their son Thomas Warren Zane, and Warren found he could think about his old friend now without the complicated mix of love and resentment that had colored those thoughts for so long. Thomas had loved Catherine in his own way, and Catherine had tried to love him back. That was enough. That had to be enough. Baby Thomas thrived through his first winter, a fat, happy baby who smiled early and often. Warren discovered he loved being a father, loved the weight of his son in his arms, the trust in those bright eyes. Catherine bloomed too, motherhood suiting her in ways that made Warren fall in love with her all over again. Spring came with its usual promise of renewal, and one morning Warren woke to find Catherine already up and dressed, standing by the window with Thomas in her arms. "What are you thinking about?" Warren asked, coming to stand beside her. "I was thinking about how strange life is," Catherine said. "How we make plans and think we know what we want, and then everything changes and we end up somewhere completely different from where we thought we'd be." "Are you happy?" Warren asked, the same question he'd asked the night they got engaged. Catherine turned to look at him, her eyes clear and certain. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible. This life, this ranch, you and Thomas, this is everything I didn't know I wanted." Warren kissed her softly, careful not to squish the baby between them. "I love you, Catherine Zane." "I love you too," she whispered back. Their second child, a daughter they named Charlotte Martha after Catherine's mother and Martha Morrison, arrived 2 years later in the spring of 1882. She was smaller than Thomas had been, more delicate, but fierce in a way that reminded Warren of Catherine. The ranch prospered as the years passed. Warren and Catherine worked hard, but smart too, building their herd carefully, making improvements to the land and buildings, establishing a reputation for quality cattle and horses. Young Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ranch work with eager enthusiasm. Charlotte proved herself just as capable, riding before she could properly walk, fearless in ways that gave Catherine heart palpitations. In 1885, Catherine gave birth to their third child, another boy they named William. He was a quiet baby, thoughtful even as an infant, content to watch the world with serious eyes. Warren loved all his children fiercely, but there was something about William that touched his heart in a special way. Green River grew slowly but steadily around them. The railroad came through in 1883, bringing new settlers and new opportunities. The town got a proper school, a bank, more shops and businesses. Warren and Catherine watched their valley transform from wild frontier to settled community, and they were glad to be part of that transformation. On their 10th wedding anniversary in June of 1889, Warren gave Catherine a locket with tiny photographs of their 3 children inside. Catherine gave Warren a new saddle she'd been saving for, custom made by the best leather worker in the territory. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch together as they had so many times before, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "You ever think about what your life might have been like if I hadn't shown up at your door that day?" Catherine asked. Warren considered the question. "Sometimes. I probably would have kept ranching, built up the herd, maybe married eventually, but it wouldn't have been this life. It wouldn't have been you and the children and everything we've built together." "I almost didn't come," Catherine admitted. "I sat on my horse at the bottom of your ridge for an hour that morning, trying to decide if I was being foolish or desperate or both. Part of me thought you'd slam the door in my face." "I might have if I'd been smart," Warren teased. "Instead, I invited my heartbreak right into my home." Catherine elbowed him. "It worked out in the end." "It did," Warren agreed, pulling her close. "Better than I could have imagined." The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and small miracles. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking over more of the ranch work as Warren's hair started going gray at the temples. Charlotte proved herself a natural with horses, training them with a patience and skill that impressed everyone who saw her work. William developed an unexpected talent for numbers and helped Warren manage the ranch's books and accounts. In the spring of 1892, Thomas announced he was courting Emily Henderson, daughter of a neighboring rancher. Warren and Catherine approved of the match, and the wedding took place that December, a joyous celebration that brought together the whole valley. Thomas and Emily built a small house on the eastern edge of Warren's land, and Thomas continued working the ranch while Emily established herself as a skilled seamstress. Charlotte, meanwhile, showed no interest in settling down, much to her mother's occasional dismay. She was content working horses and helping run the ranch, independent and fierce in her determination to make her own choices about her life. Warren secretly approved, glad his daughter wouldn't let anyone pressure her into decisions she wasn't ready for. By 1895, Warren and Catherine had been married 16 years and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. The ranch was prosperous. Their children were healthy and happy, and they'd become pillars of the Green River community. Warren served on the town council, while Catherine helped organize the church socials and taught Sunday school. One summer evening, Warren and Catherine rode out alone to the spot by the river where they'd had their first picnic all those years ago. They were older now, slower, with gray in their hair and lines around their eyes, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "I was thinking," Catherine said as they sat on a blanket watching the water flow past, "about that girl who rode up to your door 17 years ago. She was so scared and lost, convinced her life was over." "I remember her," Warren said. "I remember thinking she was the bravest person I'd ever met, coming all that way alone, asking for help when she'd rather have died than admit she needed it." "I wasn't brave," Catherine protested. "I was desperate." "Same thing sometimes," Warren said. "It takes courage to ask for help, to be vulnerable, to risk rejection." Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you opened that door. I'm glad you let me stay." "I'm glad you came," Warren said simply. "You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. Not just love, though God knows I loved you enough for 10 men, but partnership, Catherine. Someone to build a life with, to face the hard times and celebrate the good times. That's worth more than gold." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. The river sang its eternal song, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed softly. It was the sound of home, of a life well lived, of choices made and second chances seized. "I wonder what Thomas would think," Catherine said softly, "if he could see us now. See the life we've built, the family we've raised." Warren thought about his old friend, the boy he'd grown up with, the man who'd married the woman Warren loved. The resentment and pain he'd once felt had long since faded, replaced by something gentler. Gratitude, maybe, that Thomas had taken care of Catherine when Warren couldn't. Sorrow that Thomas's life had been cut short. forgiveness for all the complicated feelings that had tangled between the three of them. "I think he'd be happy for us," Warren said. "I think he'd look at young Thomas and see his own name living on, see the ranch thriving, see you happy and loved. That would be enough for him." Catherine nodded, wiping away tears. "I hope you're right." "I know I am," Warren said with certainty. "Thomas loved you, and love wants the beloved to be happy. That's all." As full dark fell, they rode back to the ranch house, where lights glowed warm in the windows and their children waited. Charlotte had dinner ready, filling the house with savory smells. William was reading by the fire while young Thomas Jr., barely walking, played with wooden blocks on the floor. Emily was there too, her hand resting on her rounded belly carrying Warren and Catherine's first grandchild. This was what they'd built from ashes and second chances, Warren thought. Not just a ranch or a house or a herd of cattle, but a family, a legacy, a future that stretched beyond them into years they wouldn't see. Catherine had come to his door widowed and desperate, and together they'd built something beautiful from that grief. Over the next few years, their family continued to grow. Emily gave birth to twin girls, giving Warren and Catherine their first grandchildren. Charlotte eventually married a horse trader from Cheyenne, though she kept working the ranch even after her wedding. William attended university in Denver, studying business and law, but came home every summer to help with the ranch work. By 1900, Warren was 63 years old and Catherine 61. They'd lived through the end of the frontier era, seen Wyoming achieve statehood in 1890, watched their valley transform from wilderness to civilization. The ranch was firmly established now, one of the most successful operations in the territory, and their children and grandchildren would carry it forward into the new century. On a crisp autumn evening in October of 1900, Warren and Catherine sat on their porch as they had countless times before. 22 years had passed since Catherine had ridden up to his door, and Warren marveled at how quickly those years had flown. "You have any regrets?" Catherine asked, the question she'd never quite stopped asking despite all the years and all the evidence of their happiness. Warren thought about it seriously, as he always did. "I regret the years we lost," he said honestly. "I regret that we didn't get this life sooner. But I don't regret anything we've done since you came back. Every day with you has been a gift, Catherine." Catherine smiled, the same smile that had captivated him when they were young. "Even the hard days, the times I was difficult or stubborn or drove you half crazy." "Especially those days," Warren said, grinning. "Life would be boring if you were easy." She laughed and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture as familiar as breathing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their land, their home, their life together. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but Warren faced it without fear. He had Catherine by his side, his children and grandchildren carrying on the legacy they'd built, and a lifetime of memories to sustain him through whatever came next. The scared widow who'd appeared at his door had become his wife, his partner, his great love. And the heartbroken cowboy who'd opened that door had found his way home at last. As darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, Warren pulled Catherine close and thought about all the roads they'd traveled to reach this moment. The grief and loss, the second chances and new beginnings, the love that had endured through years and change and all of life's complications. It had been worth it, every difficult step, every painful choice, because in the end they'd found their way to each other, and that made everything else worthwhile. Inside the house, their family gathered for dinner, voices rising in laughter and conversation. Warren and Catherine would join them soon, but for now they sat together in the twilight, two souls who'd found their way home to each other after years of wandering. The sweetheart and the best friend, the widow and the cowboy, now and forever bound together by love that had proven stronger than time, stronger than grief, stronger than all the forces that might have kept them apart. This was their story, their life, their happily ever after earned through patience and forgiveness, and the courage to take a second chance when it was offered. And as Warren held Catherine close and listened to the sounds of their family inside, he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't change a single moment of the journey that had brought them here, to this perfect evening, to this perfect life together.